Have you ever come across a story so wild it sounds like it's straight out of a movie? Well, get ready. We're about to dive into the claim of Deed 1400/98. According to a massive collection of documents, this wasn't just some run-of-the-mill real estate deal back in 1998. No. The allegation is that this single contract secretly sold the entire world, transferring global sovereignty to one person who had no idea what was happening. Today, we're going to unpack the extraordinary story laid out in these sources.
All right, so here's how we're going to tackle this. First, we'll look at the core idea, a world for sale. Then we'll get into the legal wizardry that supposedly made it all possible, this treaty in disguise. After that, we'll follow the alleged global domino effect. Then comes the spy novel stuff, a conspiracy for world power. We'll also cover the personal cost, the buyer's nightmare. And finally, we'll ask, what does all this mean for the future?
So, let's just start with the main event, the absolutely mind-bending idea at the very heart of this entire narrative.
I mean, it sounds impossible, right? But according to the source material, this isn't a hypothetical question. It's exactly what they claim went down on October 6, 1998. The argument is that hidden inside what looked like a standard property sale was a complex web of legal language with consequences that stretched across the entire globe.
And here's the kicker. The source claims this wasn't just complicated, it was intentionally deceptive. The whole point was to make the contract look like a boring real estate deal to any normal person, especially the buyer, while hiding its true function as a world-altering international treaty. A deception that was allegedly part of the plan from day one.
So how in the world could the sale of an old military barracks become a document of global power? Well, the answer, according to the source, is all in the unbelievably unique legal setup.
Think of it like this. The document had a secret identity. On the surface, you see a German real estate contract, something handled under national law. But underneath, it was engineered to operate as an international treaty of state succession, which is a whole different ballgame. And that brings us to a really important legal idea.
Okay, stick with me here, because this is the absolute key to the whole claim. State succession is a real thing in international law. It's usually what happens when countries merge or break apart. But in this case, the source argues it was used in a way nobody had ever seen before.
This right here, this is the legal linchpin. The property wasn't just any old piece of land. It was a former NATO barracks, and a part of it was being used by the Dutch Air Force. But crucially, the sources claim the Dutch Air Force is 100% integrated into NATO, so they were acting for NATO. This created a wild situation where three separate sovereign entities, Germany, the Netherlands, and NATO itself, all had overlapping rights to the same territory. You can't just sell that under German law, it's impossible. So the claim is, this unique situation forced the sale to be governed by international law instead.
And here's the alleged masterstroke. The source argues that in international law, a country doesn't actually have to sign a treaty to be bound by it. If you're just mentioned in the document and given rights or responsibilities, that's enough. So this deed allegedly created a chain of contracts by referring to other agreements, like the NATO Status of Forces Agreement. By doing that, it supposedly pulled entities like the Netherlands and NATO into its legal web without them ever putting pen to paper.
Okay, so let's say they did gain sovereignty over this one property. How does that lead from a small plot of land in Germany to the entire planet? Well, this is where the source describes a domino effect on an unbelievable scale.
The argument is this. The property, with all its infrastructure, was sold as an inseparable unit. Think of it as a tiny, self-contained, sovereign island. Now, what happens when you connect the telecom lines, the water pipes, and the power grid from that sovereign island to the national and then international networks? According to the claim, the sovereignty travels with it. It allegedly spread through these networks like a digital virus, a chain reaction that started on one little plot of land and just kept going.
And the source material gets very specific here. It's not just some vague idea. They name the networks of power that were supposedly the pathways for this takeover. We're talking telecommunications, like TKS Telepost, which services military bases, international gas networks, the European power grid, even district heating and water systems. Every single connection was another domino falling, extending this claim's sovereignty further and further.
Just when you think this can't get any stranger, it does. The documents allege this was no accident. This was a calculated, two-step conspiracy to achieve world domination.
What a plot twist, right? So the source claims Germany's grand plan was to use an unsuspecting buyer as a pawn. Step 1. Have this person acquire global sovereignty through that incredibly complex first contract. Step 2. Trick him into signing a second, much simpler-looking contract, something about local development, that would actually transfer all of that newfound global power right back to Germany.
But wait, the plot thickens. The conspiracy apparently had a counter-conspiracy. The source claims that rival intelligence agencies caught on and sabotaged the second part of the plan. They supposedly tricked German officials into thinking the power transfer worked when it actually hadn't. So if this narrative is to be believed, Germany thinks it has the power, but in reality, the transfer failed, leaving the unsuspecting buyer as the sole accidental ruler of the world.
So you might think being the person who owns the world would be pretty great. But according to these documents, for the buyer, it wasn't a life of power. It was the start of a living nightmare.
This is just one of many really disturbing stories detailed in the source material. It describes a violent physical assault on the buyer's mother, all in an attempt to get a hold of the original legal documents.
And to give you a sense of the scale of this alleged harassment campaign, just look at this number, 56. That's how many times the buyer and his mother were supposedly forcibly evicted in just 3.5 years. The documents describe a life of constant upheaval, being relentlessly chased across the country to keep them disoriented and on the run.
The list of alleged abuses just goes on and on. Infiltration of their inner circle, smear campaigns in the media, non-stop surveillance. The source even claims the buyer was imprisoned in what's described as a black site disguised as a psychiatric ward. The alleged goal of all this pressure? To break him and force him to sue in a German court. This would be the plaintiff's trap, supposedly legitimizing Germany's jurisdiction over him in the contract.
So after all of that, what happens now? Where does this leave the world? According to these documents, we're all sitting on a geopolitical ticking time bomb.
The timeline presented is pretty stark. The deed gets signed in '98. Then, in 2000, the 2-year window to legally challenge it closes, which, according to this view, makes the whole thing irreversible. And now the source points to a predicted day X in 2025, a day when a court ruling in Germany could supposedly blow the lid off this whole thing, potentially throwing the world into chaos.
When you boil it all down, these documents are doing more than just telling a wild conspiracy story. They're presenting an entirely alternate history for the last quarter century. They challenge the very foundation of our world order, suggesting all national sovereignty was secretly wiped out by a single piece of paper. And it leaves us with a pretty profound question. What does a world built on a lie actually look like? That is a very unsettling thought to end on.